First, there's something quietly devastating about watching someone smile for 20 years straight, and then one day, just stop. Not because they're broken, not because they've surrendered, but because they've finally decided that the version of themselves the world fell in love with deserves to rest. Rachael Ray spent nearly 2 decades being the most approachable woman on American television, laughing loudly, cooking fast, talking even faster, and making millions of people feel like the kitchen wasn't a battlefield, but a place where ordinary life could taste like something worth savoring. She built an empire on 30-minute meals and a personality so warm it practically radiated through your television screen. But people who shine that brightly in public tend to carry weight in private that nobody sees, and Rachael Ray's private world held fires that weren't metaphorical, floods that swallowed everything she owned, health scares that sent the internet into a spiral of fear, rumors that threatened to dismantle her marriage from the outside in, and a farewell from her husband that left fans sitting in stunned, emotional silence.
This is not the story you think you already know.
This is the version that happened when the cameras weren't rolling, and it starts long before the Food Network, long before the Emmy Awards, long before anyone outside of upstate New York had ever heard her name. Rachael Ray grew up in Lake George, New York, inside a household where food carried meaning that first went far beyond nutrition. Her mother's Italian heritage shaped the home in ways that no recipe could fully capture, because food there functioned as language, as the way love got expressed, how arguments softened, how celebrations and losses were both marked and absorbed. From childhood, Rachael absorbed the idea that cooking wasn't a chore or a performance put on for company, but a form of connection, a daily act of identity. Long before she ever stood in front of a camera, she stood beside a stove watching and learning and storing away the kind of instinctive kitchen knowledge that no culinary school can fully replicate. And that foundation would eventually become her greatest professional asset, though for years it was simply the texture of her daily existence. As a young adult, Rachael worked her way through a series of food-adjacent jobs that gave her something more valuable than technical training, and what they gave her was people. The candy counter at Macy's, restaurant management positions, retail food environments, none of these were glamorous, but all of them were educational in the most practical sense possible. Real people moved through those spaces with real questions about meals, real frustration about time, real anxiety about making the right choices at the grocery store, and Rachael was there absorbing all of it, learning how an audience thinks before she ever had one to speak to. Landing a job at a gourmet market in Albany clicked something into place. First, because customers kept coming to her with the same questions. What do I do with this ingredient? How do I make something good without spending my entire evening in the kitchen? Her answer was never just words. She showed them, right there in the store, how a complete and satisfying meal could come together in 30 minutes using ingredients they already recognized and trusted. Those in-store demonstrations turned into local television segments, and those segments turned into a concept that caught the attention of Food Network, and suddenly a woman who had never formally studied cooking occupied a national stage to do the very thing she had always done naturally, which was make food feel possible for everyone watching. The early 2000s accelerated everything, professionally and personally. And right in the middle of that momentum, she walked into a party and met the man who would change the shape of her life entirely. John Cusimano was not the obvious match for Rachael Ray, which is probably a large part of why the connection works so well. Trained as a lawyer at Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, he had built a professional life in a field that operates by completely different rules than celebrity television, but law was only one layer of who he was. He also fronted a New York-based rock band called The Cringe, serving as lead singer and guitarist, and he existed in that particular creative professional space where a resume fails to capture the actual texture of a person's life. Private by nature and genuinely comfortable with his own complexity, he had no interest in the spotlight that was rapidly expanding around the woman he would come to love. Their first conversation at that mutual friend's gathering in 2001 carried the kind of accidental charm that later becomes a story people retell. Rachael, watching a man speak enthusiastically about opera and cooking, made an assumption that turned out to be completely wrong, and she admitted later that she initially thought he might be gay. John corrected her without making it a moment. The conversation kept moving, and what followed was the kind of exchange that doesn't happen often, genuinely easy and mutually curious, flowing between food and music and culture, with the rhythm of two people who were actually paying attention to each other. By the end of that night, something had shifted between them, and Rachael later described it as instant chemistry, the rare sensation of encountering someone who is simply and undeniably different from everyone else you've previously known. They dated steadily through the early 2000s, navigating the inherent difficulty of a relationship where one person is becoming increasingly famous while the other is deliberately staying private. John handled that imbalance with a quiet confidence that many people in his position never managed to hold on to. He showed up to events, to premieres, to the mundane and the significant moments alike, without ever attempting to fold himself into her brand or position himself as part of her public identity. His music career continued, his professional work continued, his sense of self stayed intact, and he remained fully present for her life without losing his own in the process. That balance required genuine self-awareness and real security, and it was precisely what Rachael needed beside the frenetic, relentless energy of her public career. September 24th, 2005 brought their wedding in Tuscany, Italy, a location that spoke directly to their shared love of Italian culture and the food that had always connected them both. The ceremony stayed small and intimate, attended only by family and close friends, deliberately private in a season of Rachael's life that was becoming increasingly public and loud. 10 years later, in 2015, they traveled back to that same Tuscan landscape to renew their vows, marking a decade of marriage in the exact place where it began. And over the years, they built a life that divided its time between New York and Italy, eventually establishing a home in Tuscany that functioned as both sanctuary and creative space. The choice not to have children was one Rachael has spoken about openly and without apology, explaining that their careers and the shape of their lifestyle informed that decision, and instead they centered their lives around each other, their pets, their shared passions, and the kind of deep domestic partnership that functions as its own complete form of family. But marriage, first, even a genuinely strong one, doesn't exist in a sealed container immune to outside interference. And the interference directed at Rachael and John's marriage began almost as soon as the early years had settled. From the mid-2000s onward, tabloids made a recurring target out of John Cusimano, with stories surfacing regularly, most of them constructed on anonymous sourcing and sensational framing, questioning his fidelity and suggesting fractures in a marriage that those inside it consistently denied. The rumors became a kind of permanent background noise in their public life, never fully disappearing, occasionally flaring into louder and more damaging headlines. Rachael didn't respond to every story, but she wasn't passive either, and when reporting crossed from speculation into what she considered outright fabrication, she pushed back with legal force, threatening action against publications that printed claims she believed were both false and harmful to her family. One of the stranger chapters in that ongoing saga arrived in 2016 when the internet temporarily and incorrectly decided that Rachael Ray was connected to a high-profile celebrity scandal involving a fashion designer named Rachael Roy. The confusion came from nothing more than a similarity in names, Rachael Ray and Rachael Roy, but social media rarely stops to verify before it amplifies, and within hours of the initial online speculation, her name circulated in contexts that had absolutely nothing to do with her actual life. Her team moved quickly to clarify the mistake. Rachael addressed it directly and firmly, and the episode passed, but it illustrated something about what fame looks like in the digital age, which is that your name can become the center of a rumor before you've even heard the story being told about you. Through all of it, the tabloid cycles and the online confusion and the years of anonymous accusations, John stayed. He kept appearing on her shows in relaxed, natural segments, kept showing up beside her at events, kept being visibly and consistently her partner, and whatever was printed about their marriage in any given week, the image they projected together never fractured. But the heaviest trials they faced together weren't gossip. They were physical, sudden, and devastating in ways that no public statement could soften. Before television recognition, before the brand or the team or the platform, Rachael Ray lived in Queens, New York, navigating the city largely on her own terms. In 1997, she was mugged outside her apartment, the encounter sudden and aggressive, with a teenager demanding her bag and attempting to intimidate her into giving it up. Rachael didn't comply, and she fought back using a can of mace her father had given her, which sent the attacker running. No physical injuries, but the experience left its mark. Not long after that first incident, a second mugging happened elsewhere in the city, and while details of that encounter were never widely shared, the cumulative weight of two violent encounters in quick succession changed how she moved through the world, making her more alert, more cautious, more conscious of the space around her at all times. She later described both experiences as formative, the kind of moments that recalibrate your baseline sense of safety in ways you don't fully register until you're already a different person than you were before.
None of that, though, prepared her for what came in 2020. August 9th of that year, their home in Lake Luzerne,
New York, the place that represented everything quiet and personal in their otherwise very public lives, caught fire. The blaze started in the chimney and moved with terrifying speed through the structure, and by the time firefighters arrived, the house was already being consumed. When the fire ended, the building was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but completely and irreversibly gone. Rachael and John escaped physically unharmed, and she returned to that point repeatedly and clearly whenever she discussed the fire publicly, because the safety of the people mattered more than anything else. What she mourned, and did so openly and with evident pain, was the personal history that burned alongside the structure. 40 years of handwritten notebooks, personal photographs, letters and drawings and objects tied to specific moments and specific people, things that couldn't be rebuilt because they couldn't be recreated. Her description of that loss, saying she had lost a huge part of the physical evidence that they exist, carries a weight that doesn't diminish with repetition. She wasn't grieving a house. She was grieving the tangible record of a life built across decades. John's steadiness through the aftermath became something Rachael pointed to directly. While she processed what had been lost, he handled the logistics, the insurance claims, the practical steps forward that grief makes it hard to see clearly. They relocated to their Manhattan apartment, settled into a temporary rhythm, and began the slow work of planning to rebuild in Lake Luzerne, waiting for construction timelines while living out of a space that was always meant to be secondary. Then, less than a year after the fire, the apartment flooded. Hurricane Ida moved through the Northeast in September 2021 with a force that overwhelmed New York City's infrastructure in ways the city wasn't prepared for, with streets becoming rivers, subway stations filling with water, and apartment buildings across the 5 boroughs sustaining serious damage. Rachael and John's Manhattan apartment took a direct hit, with water moving through the space quickly and extensively, damaging floors, walls, ceilings, and the belongings that had survived one disaster only to be destroyed by another. Rachael described the apartment as having literally melted, and that word choice wasn't dramatic, it was accurate, because that's what extreme water damage does to interior surfaces and the objects. First, sitting on them. The timing made everything worse, because she had moved into this apartment specifically because her home had burned down, had barely settled into any sense of normal, and now this. 2 major disasters inside of 2 years, and everything physical that had been salvaged from the fire was now gone to floodwater, requiring the rebuilding process to start over entirely from a gutted space in a different part of the city. She talked about the flooding without theatrics, describing the damage plainly and focusing on the practical reality of starting again, as she had already learned how to do once before. Gratitude that no one was hurt stayed at the center of how she framed it publicly. But she was also clear-eyed about what it means to lose your personal history twice in under 2 years, to watch the physical record of your existence disappear not once, but repeatedly through nothing but catastrophic and utterly indiscriminate luck. On the professional side, Rachael's expanding empire brought a different category of challenge, and 2008 marked the launch of Nutrish, a pet food line created in partnership with Ainsworth Pet Nutrition that grew quickly into one of the top-selling pet food brands in the country. The brand carried the same approachable, natural ethos that defined her cooking philosophy: simple ingredients and familiar sourcing, and for years it performed well by every commercial measure. That changed in August 2018, when a consumer filed a class action lawsuit seeking $5 million in damages, alleging that testing had found traces of glyphosate, an herbicide, in the products, which directly contradicted the brand's natural labeling. Pet owners expressed concern online, consumer advocates raised broader questions about transparency in the industry, and headlines placed Rachael's name at the center of the controversy, even though the brand was produced in partnership with another company. By October 2023, Rachael was not listed as an active party in any connected litigation, but the questions the lawsuit raised about labeling and ingredient sourcing lingered well after the legal activity quieted. Her magazine, Every Day with Rachael Ray, which launched with genuine enthusiasm and reflected her signature accessible style, faced a slower form of erosion, with readers noting shifts in quality and focus over time, and 2019 brought its discontinuation. Cookware lines drew complaints about durability. Some recipe adaptations sparked criticism from communities who felt their culinary traditions were being oversimplified for broad commercial appeal. And running beneath all of it was a more direct professional critique, one that came most pointedly from Anthony Bourdain, who stated publicly that Rachael Ray was not a chef, but a businesswoman. His assessment circulated widely and became a reference point in ongoing conversations about whether television cooking personalities deserve to be taken seriously by the culinary world. First, Rachael never had formal culinary training, never claimed to, but in an industry that values credentials, the absence of them became a weapon in the hands of people who found her success inconvenient. Her response to all of it followed the same pattern she had developed over years of navigating loss and criticism, which was simply to keep working. She talked in interviews about learning to stay focused on her output rather than the people commenting on it, about finding stability in routine rather than reputation. And the work itself functioned as her most consistent answer to anyone who questioned whether she belonged. March 2023 brought the announcement that fundamentally changed what showing up meant for her. After 17 seasons and nearly 2 decades of daily hosting, Rachael Ray announced that The Rachael Ray Show would be ending, and the news carried no preceding rumors, no industry whispers, no sense that anything had been building toward this moment. It came from her directly, on her own terms, framed as a personal decision from the first sentence. She made clear that this was a choice, not a cancellation, not a conflict behind the scenes, not a corporate decision made over her head by people who didn't value what the show had built. 17 seasons on daytime television, 3 Daytime Emmy Awards, and nearly 2 decades of being a constant presence in American households all came to a close because she had decided, after all that time, that she wanted something different. Her public statement was warm and direct, thanking her audience and acknowledging the scope of what the show had meant before explaining that she felt ready for a different kind of chapter. The show's social media channels echoed her gratitude with a message celebrating the guests, the viewers, and the years of memories built together, and the public response came immediately and with genuine emotion. Fans shared memories of watching episodes with their parents, of learning specific techniques from her demonstrations, of turning the show on during hard stretches of their lives when they needed something familiar and warm and uncomplicated. 3 Emmy wins over the course of the run stood as formal evidence that the industry had recognized what the audience already knew, which was that the work had mattered. The shift she made wasn't away from work, but toward a different relationship with it. And Free Food Studios, the production company she launched, positioned her behind the camera rather than in front of it. Developing shows, shaping content, mentoring other creators, building projects on her own schedule, rather than the relentless daily clock of a live talk show that was the version of work she wanted now. And Italy became increasingly central to how that looked. Extended periods in Tuscany, filming and creating and living at a pace The Daily Show had never really allowed, filled the space that 17 seasons of production schedules had occupied. Her Yamo first organization continued operating, focused on improving access to healthy food for children, and it remained among the most personally meaningful of her ongoing commitments. And then, when the show ended and that chapter formally closed, John Cusimano said something publicly that stayed with people long after the news cycle moved on. He spoke about pride, not the polished, publicist-approved kind, but something more lived in and specific to what he had actually witnessed. Watching Rachael build something from a simple idea about 30-minute meals into a 17-season institution that shaped American daytime television was not an abstract achievement for him the way it might be for an outside observer, because he had been beside her for all of it, sitting across the dinner table when the cameras weren't there, navigating the production schedules and the long seasons and the weight of showing up every single day. He acknowledged the audience that had treated the show as part of their daily routine for nearly 20 years, and he recognized the production teams who made those episodes happen. The people who arrived before the cameras turned on and stayed long after they shut off, whose names never appeared in the headlines. What came through most clearly, though, was what it had meant to him personally to know Rachael before any of this existed. He had met her before the talk show, before the format was established, before the legacy was anything more than potential waiting to become something real, and he had watched her evolve from local food segments in Albany to national Anaya television, to a brand that reached across multiple industries and touched millions of lives. Watching that from the inside, as the person living it with her rather than observing it from a distance, carried an emotional weight that he described with evident feeling. He also addressed something that rarely gets spoken about directly in these kinds of public goodbyes, which was the reality of being the partner of someone very famous for a very long time. Years of tabloid stories had constructed a version of him that bore little resemblance to his actual life, framing him as a problem, a liability, a question mark in a marriage that those inside it understood completely differently. He had navigated all of that quietly, continuing his music, maintaining his professional work, staying present beside her, even as headlines periodically suggested he shouldn't be there. The goodbye carried the weight of all that history without bitterness, acknowledging everything they had moved through together, the celebrated and the devastating, the very public and the intensely private, the seasons where everything went right and the years where almost nothing did. And he made clear that the show's ending was not the ending of anything that actually mattered, because Rachael's creativity had not slowed and her drive had simply redirected into new work that was already taking shape. That distinction, delivered by the man who had been beside her through fires and floods and Emmy wins and anonymous tabloid accusations and everything else the years had carried, landed with the weight of someone who had actually been there for all of it and knew precisely what he was talking about. Rachael Ray's story, stripped of the highlights and the awards and the brand extensions, is a story about endurance, not the glamorous kind that makes for good television, but the quiet, grinding, day after day kind that looks too much like ordinary life to be easily packaged. She lost things that couldn't be replaced and rebuilt from almost nothing, twice. She absorbed professional criticism from people who misunderstood what she was trying to do and kept working anyway. She weathered accusations that weren't true and rumored fractures in a marriage that held. She kept showing up through all of it, kept being the person millions of people had come to rely on for something as simple and genuinely meaningful as the feeling that dinner was manageable and that life, despite everything, was still worth cooking for. And now, as she moves into a quieter and more intentional version of that same drive, the man who watched every chapter of it unfold from the inside has said what needed to be said, and what he said was simply that it was extraordinary, and so is she.